story of my life. People don't warn me of stuff. They just do stuff. They like, go with the flow, Lightsey. Roll with it. So I'm Pamela Lightsey. I am Associate Dean at the Boston University School of Theology, and I'm also Assistant Clinical Faculty there. So I'm specifically responsible for a number of things related to community and lifelong learning, and also I teach in the area of theology and ethics. The book has been years in the making, and it came about as I was struggling with my own sexual identity and trying to talk about who I was. And at the same time that I was trying to talk about who I understand myself to be, I heard this fabulous term, which is pejorative for some people, and that is queer. And the idea behind the phrase as it's now being used is that there's a resistance, a pushback to being put in a box in terms of one's sexual identity. So I thought that's exactly what I want to say. That's exactly how I understand myself to be. I don't want to be a divided kind of dichotomous person. I want to be thought of as someone whose sexuality is complex. And so queer theology is written with that in mind, to a particular audience, within a particular context, at a particular time, to talk about human sexuality, and also to talk about the work of the church and how the church ought to respond and be in the world. So it took me a number of years to write, and during the time that I was writing it, the nation turned its focus to the things that were going on in Ferguson, racial unrest. And I thought, I can't finish this book because I need to participate in the movement. And my participation in the movement helped me to understand, helped me to see the power of queer Black women as leaders in protest. And so you get some of that in the book also. You get a conversation about human sexuality, but you specifically get a conversation about human sexuality for Black, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and women who call themselves queer, who self-identify as queer, working as leaders within a protest movement, and what that means for the church and what that means for the nation. Yes, queer theory has been around. It is it's a budding field of study, but in comparison to queer theology, it's been people have been working in the field of queer theory for quite a bit longer than queer theology. So queer theory looks at the human sexuality, looks at normativity. The world has for quite some time thought of human sexuality in binaries. That is, either one is heterosexual or one is homosexual. And queer theories really begin to deconstruct this notion that you can take a person, a human being, in all their complexity, and sit them in categories that are only twofold, when in fact, as complex human beings, it's really difficult to put us in a box. And so queer theory deconstructs that, looks at gender, looks at human sexuality, looks at performativity, looks at how I perform my gender on any given day, and looks at how the world how we interact with the world as human beings. And that's what queer theorists are doing. Queer theology adds another level to that, in that we want to think about the context of these human beings. how do they relate in their world as people of faith, as people who have spiritual practices, and what do the doctrines of the church have to do, and how do the doctrines of the church impact upon the lives of queer persons? So I'm in a particular context. I'm a Black woman working in the academy who is also an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. So the struggle right now in the United Methodist Church is a struggle to be true to what we say, and that is, we say that we believe that all persons are persons of sacred worth. But at the same time, there is these discriminatory policies or discriminatory rules within what we call our book of discipline, and those rules say that an out practicing homosexual cannot be ordained, and cannot do the work as a clergy person within the United Methodist Church. So the first thing is coming out as a queer lesbian is a major step for me. There are no other out queer Black lesbian ordained elders in the United Methodist Church at this point. And, I want there to be more, but we've not heard of any ordained queer lesbian elders in the United Methodist Church. So that's a step in and of itself. As a scholar, I have the privilege of being able to do research and to write about various ideas, to look at the doctrines of the church, to look at the dogmas in the church's history, and to write about those. And I thought it was really important. I do still think it's really important to try to write about those things from my context, because I know that there are people who may be struggling with their sexual identity, who need to hear from a scholar, and also need to hear from somebody who really understands the church about what it means to be queer and what that says about their relationship with God. And it's particularly important for Black people, because before this year, or perhaps the last 5 years, there has been a real to be Black and to be queer in the Black community has been a bit of a challenge, to say the least. Homophobia is real in the Black community, and I wanted to address that in my book. And so I do that from the perspective of a scholar, because one of the major things that hurts Black queer persons is this use of Bible. Is what takes place in our churches and takes place in our communities, our faith communities, on any given week, that questions whether or not we are in right relationship with God, because we self-identify in ways that are not in step with heteronormativity. Well, in this journey for me, what I've learned is that it's really important for me to write about and to privilege the experiences of Black queer women. And the reason it's important for me to do that as a womanist is because within the very definition of what it means to be a womanist is this statement that says a womanist is a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. And I wanted to explore that portion of Alice Walker's definition of what it means to be a womanist, because there had been no full manuscript written by a womanist scholar on queer theology. And so this book is a first of its kind, and so I'm very, very happy about that. But it is also a labor of love that allows me to go into the context of Black, lesbian, bisexual, transgender women, to look at their lives, to look at their history, to look at their work, and to kind of put that into a book and to share with those who are in this particular context, but also to say to the nation, our struggles impact the entire nation. And what we do, the successes that we have as queer women, have been successes that have really helped the nation. So you look at someone like Barbara Jordan, the attorney, fabulous, did excellent work as a litigator and was a lesbian woman. You look at the lives of other queer black women who have themselves been clergy and have worked in other fields. And they may or may not have been out at the time, but their work is impacting the nation in ways that people just don't pay attention to. And so my book digs into that and uncovers that for people. So you get an understanding of the caliber of people who are among you, rather than simply think about a person's human sexuality. And as I talk about in the book, about what we do in the bed. We are far more than, persons to be thought of in accordance to what we do in the bed. We're thinking persons. We are protesters. We are mothers. We are politicians. We're in all fields and we're doing the work. And I wanted to write about that. People often ask me, given the discrimination in the United Methodist Church, why do you stay? Why is it important for you to stay in the United Methodist Church? And I remind people that I love the church. The United Methodist Church has been good to me. It is a place whose social principles I really embrace. I think it's good. I think it's good that our church really stands for justice in ways beyond the four walls of the church. I grew up Baptist, have been related to the Pentecostal church, and so I understand those contexts and was really blessed to have been a member of those contexts. But within the United Methodist Church, something about Wesley's stance against slavery, when it wasn't in vogue to stand against something like that, really resonated with me. I have a deep affinity with people who kick back against injustice, even if their voice is a minority voice. And so, look, I'm kicking back against an injustice in a very Wesleyan way. I'm saying that homophobia is wrong. I'm writing about it and saying that it's wrong. And I'm also really doing it in a way that is critical to what we say as United Methodists regarding our social principles. This is a social issue. This is one of the premier social issues of our time, and that is how we relate to one another over and against, and including how we move and be, how we perform, the performativity of our gender, our sexual identity, our sexual expressions. Those things are important. They should not be relegated to just a small compartment of our lives. It is who we are, but it is not all that we are. And that's why it's important for me to write in this way. And I think it's very Wesleyan. I grew up in the 60s, so I remember being among the first to be bused outside my neighborhood to desegregate a predominantly white school. I remember and have had the experience of being attacked verbally because of who I am as a black person. And when I looked at what was happening in Ferguson, because I am also a veteran of the United States Army. So to watch two things collide, racial tensions, and then to see a militarized police force on a civilian street just made my hair stand on edge. And I said, I can't be true to who I am as a black woman, as a womanist who believes in the well-being of a total community, and as a queer lesbian woman, not being involved in this civil rights movement. This is another level, another layer of the civil rights movement, in my opinion, which has been going on since the first Black person was placed in chains and brought to America against their will. This is a continuation. This is another level. And I've been fighting against racism since I was a little girl. And so it seemed to me that it was just necessary that I put everything on hold and go and join the protest movement in Ferguson, because I thought, that okay, I can not only march with my community, but I can write about this. I can have conversations on the street about what justice means. I can dialogue with young adults and with clergy persons, bringing to the conversation my particular expertise, and that's the expertise of theology and ethics. And I think that when a human being says, I want justice, that's a theological conversation. When human beings cry out and say, don't shoot me, that's a theological conversation, even as much as it is a conversation that is looking at legislation and policing in America, because we're talking about what? Human lives. Human lives are at stake. And the human lives that are at stake are lives that God has created. And that is very theological for me. Remember that there is a very critical and important place in Black communities for the Black church or Black churches. Now, that's a whole nother conversation about whether there is such a thing now as the Black church, because we're really moving into sort of essentialist language. But to the extent that there is a community of believers that's very tight-knit within the African American community, which is largely Christian, but not totally Christian, should not be lost. And the impact of Black churches and Black religious leaders in the Black community for civil rights should not be understated, even at this time. I was in Ferguson and I saw Black Muslims on the streets of Ferguson in the protests, supporting the protests. There were persons who were Buddhist, Black Buddhists on the streets in protest in Ferguson. So this really interfaith. Now, the question has been asked, why don't we see more of these religious leaders in the Black Lives Movement protest? I would kind of push back yes and no. There you see Tracy Blackman, Reverend Tracy Blackman. You see Reverend F. Willis Johnson. You see Reverend Sekou. You see Reverend Starsky Wilson. These are just prominent Black clergy who are on the forefront of the Black Lives protest movement. And their work has been phenomenal, continues to be phenomenal. But just as you had with the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement was a new phenomena in American social justice history, and that is that you could not point to a centralized leadership. In the Black Lives Matter movement, we like to say that it is leaderful. Rather than lacking leadership, it is leaderful. So in my opinion, I'll just go back to a little Black history, it is very much in line with this idea from Ella Baker about participatory democracy. And that is that we all have a part to play, and at any given time, your level of expertise may be what's needed. Another time, your level of expertise may be what's needed. So it is the community encouraging in a very beautiful way and lifting up the skills and the expertise of persons who are not necessarily the talking heads on CNN and MSNBC and all the other national media networks. Now, there are some persons that the media like to go to, and largely they are not clergy persons, but this is a leaderful event. And that's what I like people to keep in mind. And this, for me, is just really demonstrates some of the teaching that has flowed over and remained in the African American community from the civil rights era of the 60s. What this movement does really best is that it says Black Lives Matter. And when it says Black Lives Matter, it means all Black lives matter. And to the extent that those Black lives that matter are persons of faith who go to church on any given Sunday, who are members in mosque, in synagogues, and who are worshipful people, then clergy and faith leaders need to hear and be sensitive to what's going on in the lives of parishioners who may show up on any given Sunday or through the week, but who are also very much involved in the protest movement. And I was at a church here in Atlanta last night, and the theme was about Black Lives Matter. And so the black churches are very much in touch with what's going on within the movement, because the movement is not separate from the everyday lives of Black people. And so because the movement is not separate, in fact, is really intentionally looking at the everyday lives of Black people and the safety of Black people, then so is the church. We are not dichotomous in that sense. We are all part of one body. And that's that kind of Pauline idea of the one body of Christ. When I think about being made whole, I am actually thinking about the challenges of living in a society, in a world. Some people say that it's broken. I don't know that I want to use that imagery of the world being broken as much as I want to think about a world that is suffering. And any moment we can look at Twitter, we can look at Facebook, we can look at the news and see places in our world where that suffering really is impacting ordinary persons, and that suffering being oppression, whether that oppression is laid upon individuals because of human greed, human hatred, so on and so forth, is really important to look at, because what it causes the human being to feel is a sense of incompletion, or a sense of fragmentation, that somehow, for instance, because I'm not wealthy, then I need to continue to strive. I'm not really everything that I can be because I haven't made $1 million. And what I'm trying to say in the book is, you are whole as you are, but what we need to do is work on the oppression that causes you to suffer and causes you to feel as though you are less than. And that's what I want people to really get a sense of when they read my book. That is, that they are not less than, but that they are persons of sacred worth, even in the midst of oppression, that God looks at them as whole people, not as broken people, not as sinners to be sort of secluded until you get your stuff right from the rest of the world or from God's community, that you are whole and that you are good enough. But what we really do need to do is come together to address those forces that make us feel as though we're not whole, that make us feel as though we are less than. I'm really working on that kind of idea as I walk through my book. In the queer community, The quest for wholeness is letting go of the lies of homophobia that suggests that because I am in love with someone of the same sex, that God is looking at me as less than, or as, to use a biblical term that's often hurled at members of the LGBTQ community, that somehow you are not simply a sinner, but you are a reprobate sinner. And to be reprobate is to be beyond redemption. You have just gotten to the place where you're beyond redemption. And so what I'm suggesting, what I'm arguing, what I'm declaring in my book is that that is not the case, that God indeed does love you. And I'm giving the LGBTQ community an opportunity to think about God loving them as whole persons rather than as persons who need to come up to some image that is laid upon them by oppressors. And those oppressors who have a very homophobic perspective about life. Three professors. Jacqueline Grant, who was my teacher, and she's considered one of the mothers of Womanist Theology. And Jacqueline Grant wrote this excellent book entitled White Women's Christ, Black Women's Jesus, which is a phenomenal book that privileges the narratives of Black women. Now, I might have gotten that twisted. It might be it is White Women's Christ, Black Women's Jesus. And what she does in that book is really privilege the narrative of Black women and talks about our theology in very healthy ways for Black women. And she was one of my first mentors, helped me to really look at womanist theology as a field of discipline, as a methodology for writing about my context, and that's the context of an African-American woman. Randall Bailey, who just retired from the ITC, is a Hebrew biblical scholar, and he has been addressing homophobia for years, and I fell in love with how he looks at the text and actually asks students not simply to do the exegesis of the text, but to think about the motivation behind why a particular scripture may be in the text, and to interrogate it, to do a strong interrogation of the text that is not a criticism of God, because God can hold up over and against any criticisms we may as human beings have, but it really is a criticism of how the text has been canonized, how the biblical text has been canonized, and why particular things are in there. Another professor who is just was a phenomenal impact on my life is a professor by the name of Riggins Earl, an ethicist. And I call Riggins' name because he took time with students to meet with them, to talk about philosophy. And you see a little philosophy in in my book, Our Lives Matter. And that is because of the strong philosophical teachings that Riggins Earl did with several students, including myself, on weekends when he didn't have to do that. He really insisted that we understand some of the philosophical conceptualizations that are even apparent in the Bible itself. And so he took me down that road in philosophy, and I've used it to try to unpack for the novice to queer theology some of the framework, rather than just talking about queer theology, talking about some of the philosophy that underpins it, that frames the research itself. I was really in angst about, okay, how much do I put in this book, and how do I write this book? I have a friend, when we were going through doctoral studies, you read so many books, or you're supposed to read so many books, and some of those books you never get through. And some of the books are so dense that it's so difficult to understand them. And my friend and I, Renee Harrison, we said, when we start writing, we want to write books that everyday citizens can read. Okay. I had that in mind as I was writing the book. I was tearing up pages, one, to make sure that it was readable. Secondly, to make sure that it was scholarly. But I also wanted to make sure that it was condensed enough, short enough, so that a person could read the book, put it aside, and then be influenced or inspired to go back and read it again. So I intentionally didn't want to write a 400-page book. I wanted it small enough, I wanted it accessible enough, and I wanted the language to be almost a language of love. I wanted the reader, as they're reading the book, to feel as though my arms were around them, saying, this is my gift to you, as they're reading it. So I hope that I've done that for everybody who reads the book.